Now, the next thing that we like a mixer to do is route signals. On a lot of recording mixers, you'll see these little push buttons, normally next to the faders, that route the signal to subgroups and other places. The most common form of routing, which would be pretty intuitive to a lot of you, is to send a channel's output to the left and right bus. Let's say, for example, you were working at the local airport Hilton as a one-man band, and you had your channel 1 was your vocal mic, you had a guitar on channel 2, say a drum machine, sequencer, synthesizers, a few other inputs there. Now, in order for you to get a paycheck, you need to route these inputs here into the left and right bus, which then go out to the speakers, which then entertain all the drunken businessmen. Just next to each channel fader, we have these little buttons we talked about before that allow us to route each channel to the left and right bus. We can also route to other destinations called subgroups. You'll notice that the mixer starts to take kind of a different look from this point on out. On the right-hand side of many mixers, you will find the subgroups and the left and right bus. We already understand what the left and right bus does, but in order to understand the subgroups, let me give you this example. Let's imagine you're running sound for a small club band, and you've mic'd up, say, a drum kit into the first 8 channels. You've got kick drum, snare drum, hi-hat, overheads, and your toms, and then you have guitars, keys, and, say, vocals. But the first 8 channels have been used up by the drum kit. Now, the drummer's girlfriend in the middle of the third song comes over and says, "I want to hear more snare drum." Well, normally you'd ignore her, but her dad owns the PA company, so you want to make her happy. So this is easy. You want some more snare drum? You just grab that channel that the snare drum is plugged into, and you give her a little bit more snare drum. What happens later on in the evening when the girl comes over and her father comes over and they say, "We want to hear more drums, the entire drum kit, and just in the choruses of this song"? Well, if you're dexterous enough, you can grab every fader and move it up and down every time that chorus comes around. Or you can assign all of these channels here, all of these 8 channels, onto a subgroup or subgroups. That way, instead of moving all these faders, you can move just 1 or 2 of these subgroups. You can go to each of these 8 drum channels, and instead of directly routing them to the left and right bus, you can assign them to, say, subgroups 1 and 2 for a stereo mix. You're now sending the drums to these 2 subgroup faders, that's subgroups 1 and 2, instead of directly to the left and right bus. That means that these 2 subgroups here will be your master drum levels of the entire drum kit. And finally, what you need to do is make sure that these 2 subgroups are in turn assigned to the left and right bus. This last one is really important because, as you remember, we took each individual drum channel here and we defeated it in the left and right bus. So if that's all we did, just assign it to these groups here without in turn assigning them to the left and right bus, the drums wouldn't come out of the speakers, the girl wouldn't talk to us again, and more importantly, the father would say, "You're never going to work in this town again." So always remember to follow that flow and make sure that it's coming out the routing that we need it to come out. And of course, you can use this grouping method for anything else that might make sense, something like grouping all your backing vocals together, or maybe even a horn section. You could have 4 or 5 horn mics, defeat them to the left and right bus, but instead send them to another set of groups here, and then assign them to the left and right. So you have master horns, say master backing vocals. So what we must get out of this is that these subgroup assign buttons are a way to assign the output of any particular channel to either the left-right bus or a subgroup or subgroups. In the last example, we used these subgroups as kind of like premix points to the left and right bus, but in a recording situation, these guys are our lifelines to our multitracks. Each of the subgroups typically have their own output. If you were to plug these into the recording inputs of your multitrack, you then have the power to assign any channel to any of the tracks on your multitrack. Imagine this. We'll get back to just channel 1 here. I have the power to record channel 1 onto any of these tracks here, by pressing the corresponding button, assigning it to a subgroup, and then that subgroup would then go out to my multitrack. So if I wanted to record on track 1, I would press down group 1 here, bring up group 1's fader, and I would arm the first track on the multitrack. Same thing with 8. I could just press button number 8 down here, bring up group number 8, and arm track 8 here. In the last example where we grouped a whole drum kit together, I could bring up that entire drum kit, assign them to groups 1 and 2, and then record that onto tracks 1 and 2. But there's one little thing we need to explain to fully understand this. We all pretty well know what a pan knob does. Just like a balance knob on your home stereo, you pan it to the left and your signal goes to the left speaker. You pan it to the right and voila, you go to the right speaker. With subgroups, however, it also assists in sending a channel to the correct subgroup. You'll notice that each subgroup quite often doesn't have its own button. So for example, in this mixer, groups 1 and 2 share one button, as do 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and 7 and 8. To make sure that a channel is routed correctly to a specific subgroup, you must do two things. First, press the appropriate button to narrow it down to, say in this example, subgroups 1 or 2. Then, finally, pan the signal all the way to the left if you're wanting to route to subgroup 1, or fully to the right for sub 2. Same thing for all the groups. First the button and then the pan. If you just pressed subgroup 1 and 2's button here and panned it all the way up to the middle, you'd actually be splitting your signal between groups 1 and 2. Half would go to 1 and half would go to 2. You'll notice that on a lot of mixers, the pan knob, as well as being marked left and right, is also marked odd and even. This will give you a clue of where the signal is being routed. If, for example, I pressed groups 7 and 8 and I pan to the left or the odd side, I would be routing it to the odd of those pair, which would be 7. If I pan it all the way to the right, which is our even side, I would be routing it to the even side of this pair, which would be subgroup 8. Normally just above the faders you'll find the aux send section. This particular mixer has 6 aux sends. These sets of knobs can send a small amount of that channel signal out of their aux sends output. This is just another way to route signal, but instead of routing a channel's entire signal, as we did a moment ago through our subgroups, we can route just a certain amount of that signal which goes out of our aux sends. Now, what could we use aux sends for? Well, what we could do is send differing amounts of signal across all of these channels that could go out to, say, a headphone amp. That way we could have an entirely different mix all the time, not disturbing the mix that we have down here that goes out to our speakers. But certainly the most frequent use of aux sends is to send differing amounts of signal out to an effects device. Imagine that I connect a cable from aux send 3 of my mixer and connect the other end to the input of my effects device. By adjusting the amount of aux send 3 on this particular channel, I can decide how much of that signal gets sent to my effects device. Now, sending part of a signal out to an effects device in itself accomplishes nothing. We wouldn't hear any effect at all. In order to hear that effect, we need to return the output of that effect device back into our mixer. And we can do that in a couple of ways. We can either return that in a couple of spare channels, or else, more often than not, we can return them in specialized effect returns. So now we have the ability of sending no signal out to our effects, a little, or a lot. And in turn, the effects device will reverberate at that level. There are other special functions of a mixer, but basically a mixer balances signals across a number of channels, allows us to change the frequency content of any channel through EQ, route channels to subgroups in order to either pre-mix signals or route them out to multi-track recorders, and send varying amounts of each channel out of auxiliary sends through your effect processors and finally back into your mixer.